Hello, this is Fred Haight speaking, and welcome to a presentation that I have prepared especially for Plato's Academy in the 21st century, and especially for the young people who will be leading the world through the 21st century and beyond. I entitled it, Fight Like Beethoven. I must caution you, though, against revolutionary movements which say that nothing from the human past was any good. We're a new generation. We are starting afresh as if this were day one. Here you see the new Republican calendar introduced during the French Revolution, which created brand new months out of nowhere on not correlating to the old months. The decimal system determined the number of hours in a day, and indeed it was hard to tell what day one really was, and no one knew what Sunday was. There is a danger that movements which have committed such a clean break with the past can also commit a clean break with the respect for human life and morality that has developed over the centuries. Such movements easily become capable of mass murder. You cannot fight for the future without reaching back to the best of the past, which is often much better than what surrounds you today. In order for the poet Dante to ascend from his inferno towards paradise, he had to consult one of the greatest minds of the past who lived over a millennium before him, but still is someone he considered a friend, the great Roman poet Virgil. And today, for us, as creative artistic minds, there are perhaps no better models than Beethoven and Schiller as guides to the future. And I'm going to concentrate especially on the case of Beethoven in this presentation. The second half of the 18th century was a time of the greatest hope and optimism that the world had seen. Though important groundwork had been laid earlier in the century by such genii as J.S. Bach and Leibniz, the real breakthrough at the end of the century was a revolution in the establishment of statecraft, nations, and constitutions. Though the need for republican forms of government was known at least since Plato, for most of the 2,000 years after his time, the world was dominated by empires and kingdoms, monarchies. The American Revolution was the watershed in modern history, and it inspired the world. This painting, for example, of George Washington crossing the Delaware, which everybody assumes is an American painting, was actually painted a good half century later in Germany by a man named Leutze for his fellow Germans who had been inspired by the American Revolution to seek freedom in their own country. Now, some of you may say, well, how can the American Revolution claim to be a watershed when they declared that all men are created equal, yet failed to free the slaves? There were many among the founding fathers who did wish to outlaw slavery in the Constitution, and Benjamin Franklin was one of the most vocal of them. But when I said it was the most optimistic time, I didn't mean most optimistic in terms of having rose-colored glasses on and hoping for the best. I meant optimistic in terms of the potential to win a fight. The American South had an economy based entirely on slavery, the plantation model, to the extent where the number of slaves outnumbered the European settlers. Now, you may well ask, how did the American southern colonies get to be so backwards and different from the northern colonies? I have documented elsewhere that mass black African slavery was introduced into the American colonies by the first Earl of Shaftesbury and his sidekick John Locke. Yes, that John Locke, supposed father of our rights and our law. Shaftesbury and his associates first created the basis for mass African slavery in their sugar plantations in Barbados, and then transferred the model wholesale to the new colony which they themselves had created, Carolina, particularly the southern part of Carolina. Their purpose was not financial gain, it was to stop the movement towards independence in the American colonies, which they already feared and had stated so. It is not surprising that South Carolina was not only the state that threatened to undermine and sabotage the American Revolution if slavery were banned, but the state that led the secession, opening the Civil War. Here is a link where you can read more about this if you wish. Though it took another century and a great civil war for the United States to constitutionally outlaw slavery, I think that the necessity for and possibility of that victory was embedded in the very founding of the nation. Similar ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity took place in revolutionary France. Though the French Revolution was subverted, what had taken hold in America was now being transplanted to the very continent of Europe. The great German poet Friedrich Schiller was profoundly inspired by these political developments. In his poem, The Artists, Schiller looks forward to the developments in the upcoming 19th century. How gracefully, O man, do you, your palm branch holding, stand at the century's unfolding, in proud and noble manhood's prime, the ripest son of time. In that passage, Schiller expresses his great hope and optimism for mankind in the upcoming century. But neither is he naive. He saw the degeneration of the French Revolution into a bloodfest, and like the English poet Percy Shelley, he saw artists as the unacknowledged legislators of mankind. Again, from his poem, The Artists, Schiller addresses the role of the artist. The dignity of man into your hands is given. Its keeper be. It sinks with you, or with you it will be risen. And he calls upon them to unite. The coming century's fair dawn, on thousand twisting pathways chasing, so rich in multiplicity, come forward then, with arms embracing, around the throne of unity. Such advances in statecraft were only made possible by equal advances in science and art. Here we shall concentrate on the musical art. The period of about 75 years, from Joseph Haydn through Mozart to Beethoven, was the most intense period of musical development the world has ever seen. I am leaving aside the case of their predecessor, Johann Sebastian Bach, whose music had been suppressed so badly that his own sons did not play it, and though Haydn and Mozart were educated by his sons, Haydn did not know J.S. Bach, and Mozart was not exposed to him until 1782, when at the age of 26 he was introduced to the music of a titan, J.S. Bach, of whose existence he had been unaware. So, although Haydn did not know J.S. Bach, he did know his son Emanuel, and there were other positive influences such as Italian music and Italian opera. And with that, this genius from a poor family and a small town with no musical background began to forge a new type of music. A period of about 75 years, from around 1750 to 1825, led by Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, comprised the greatest period of musical discovery in the history of the human race. A period of 75 years is short enough to fit within the memory of one person's lifespan. My grandfather lived from the late 1800s to the 1970s and had conscious memories of both the Wright brothers flying the first airplane and the first man landing on the moon. What a wealth of experience during one person's life. But music, painting, poetry, and drama all degenerated during his lifetime. To get an equivalent of the type of progress he experienced, from the Wright brothers to the man in the moon, in music we must reach back to this 75-year period from 1750 to 1825. To do that, I will compare different settings of the same text over that period. It's the last section of the Nicene Creed from the Catholic Mass. The words go as follows. Et expecto resurrectionem mortuorum et vitam venturi seculi. Amen. That can have a literal biblical meaning, the resurrection of the dead referring to the last judgment, and the life of the world to come referring to going to heaven. But its meaning could also lie in a beautiful metaphor. In that beautiful metaphor, the life of the world to come may not just refer to you personally, whether you get to heaven or not, but laying the groundwork with your life for future generations. The life of the world to come, thus referring to those who come after us. That in turn changes awaiting the expectation of the dead from bodies rising up from the ground to the meaning of all the lives of those who came before us. We owe everything to those who came before us. Every discovery, every gift of knowledge, every sacrifice. People who gave their lives in wars, parents who did without so that their children could get an education. Were they fools to do that? Should they have merely sought pleasure? If we throw up our hands and say there's no point, I'm only going to seek pleasure, then we are condemning them to a second death. If we, however, create a better future, even if it's in a form that they might not have recognized, then they are resurrected. And I am not recommending self-denial here. Developing your creative powers for the benefit of mankind is the most joyous thing you can do, and a life of indulging in sensuous pleasures you might find will become quickly boring. The creed, or credo, has a lot of words in it, and there's a tendency in the early days of composers to just spit them out like a priest on a Sunday. You got a lot of words to just get through and get over with. As they develop their powers, they find the capability to draw out the ideas in a more and more beautiful way. And that brings up a paradox. It would seem easy to say, wow, this version is so much better than that one. And in a way, it's not. They're all discoveries, and discoveries of principle. Haydn was a genius. Mozart was a genius. Beethoven was a genius. In a certain way, it's like science. Are we to think any the less of Kepler because he left certain problems, identified certain problems to be solved by those who came after him, such as Leibniz and Gauss? Or do we celebrate the entire chain of creative discoveries? I will start with Haydn's very first Mass, written in 1749 at the age of 17. On the one hand, it's a marvelous accomplishment for such a young man, but you also have to put it in perspective. J.S. Bach still had 1 year to live and was completing his great art of the fugue, something of which Haydn was simply unaware. In all of these settings, I am going to omit the sentence about awaiting the resurrection of the dead and concentrate on the life of the world to come. Amen, because that's what the composers increasingly began to put emphasis on. In this one, though, you will notice that Haydn puts the emphasis on the word Amen simply as the close to the credo section. And here is one that I believe Haydn wrote in 1776. Can it get any better? Mozart was 24 years younger than Haydn, but they loved each other like father and son. In fact, Mozart called him Papa Haydn. Listen to what Mozart did in 1779 when he was 23 years old with this phrase in his setting of the famous Coronation Mass. While I do not find that any of Mozart's settings of this particular phrase demonstrate anywhere close to adequately his tremendous progress over Haydn, you will notice in the next example how he is constantly punctuating it with the word credo, I believe. We hear the constant searching for the right idea. Can it get any better? As a boy, Mozart was inspired by a breakthrough new symphony by Haydn and wrote it out by hand, note for note. Later, when Mozart wrote his sixth quartets dedicated to Haydn, Haydn wrote back to Mozart's father, "I know of no other composer on the level of your son." They were like father and son, and when Mozart died, for years after, you could not mention his name to Haydn without Haydn bursting out into tears at the mere thought of the loss of such a good friend and such a great composer. The young Mozart learned from Haydn, but then the adult Haydn learned from Mozart. Haydn continued to develop his own talents. Of course he did. That was his whole life. He wouldn't have stopped. But how do you separate that from how his own internal development was influenced by what he learned back from Mozart? We will listen to the same phrase as set by Haydn in his famous Mass for Times of Trouble in 1798, a good 7 years after Mozart's death. And ask yourself, what are we listening to? Are we listening to Haydn as influenced by Mozart in a linear way? Or can we perhaps hear Haydn smiling at the thought that Haydn taught Mozart his own discoveries, something new that no one else in the world knew. They were his discoveries. But in those discoveries, Mozart discovered riches and potentials which Haydn had not even dreamt existed, and therefore modified his own discoveries according to what he had learned back from Mozart. So what are we listening to? Well, individual minds are sovereign, so pieces do have specific composers, but there's also a quality of love that you're listening to, and I cannot help but think of the words of Shakespeare. So they loved, as love in twain had the essence but in one. Two distincts, division none. Number there in love was slain. The same passage from Haydn's 1798 Mass, written 7 years after the death of Mozart. Notice this time that the words et vitam venturi seculi have as much weight as amen. Can it get any better? Actually, a whole lot better. As a young man, Beethoven was a student of Haydn, and I do not believe that that relationship was as acrimonious as often presented. And he also auditioned in front of Mozart, who, according to the record, told people, keep your eye on that young man, he will astound the music world. There was, however, a seismic phase change, a shift in the self-conception of society, which Beethoven grew up with. He was only 6 years old when the Declaration of Independence was signed, and he expressed his open support for the American Revolution. He once told one of his royal patrons, "You are what you are because of accident of birth. I am what I am because of what I made myself to be. There will be 1,000 princes, but there will only be one Beethoven." As great as the works that we've been listening to are, works of art in forms of constitutions and republics were being written, and if art was going to keep its leadership role, it was going to have to move ahead. Schiller was only 10 years older than Beethoven and had written that life was moving ahead so fast that art had better get to it if it was going to keep up and not be left behind in the dust. In his last play, Wilhelm Tell, written in 1804, Schiller invokes the spirit of the American Revolution. Schiller takes the Rütli Oath from 1291, the founding document of a free Switzerland, and rewrites it, including echoes of the Declaration of Independence of 1776. From the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute a new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. When a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty, to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Compare that to Schiller's version of the Rütli Oath from his 1804 play, Wilhelm Tell. No, there is a limit to the tyrant's power. When the oppressed can find no justice, when the burden grows unbearable, he reaches with hopeful courage up into the heavens and seizes hither his eternal rights, which hang above, inalienable, and indestructible as stars themselves. The primal state of nature reappears, where man stands opposite his fellow man. As a last resort, when not another means is of avail, the sword is given him. The highest of all goods we may defend from violence. Thus stand we before our country. Thus stand we before our wives and before our children. We will become a single land of brothers, nor shall we part in danger and distress. We shall be free, just as our fathers were, and sooner die than live in slavery. We shall rely upon the highest God, and we shall never fear the might of men. Schiller's play helped shape the nation of Switzerland. It is performed there every year, and on its 200th anniversary in 2004 was performed here on the Ruetli Plain. At the base of that Ruetli Plain is a monument, the Schiller Stone, erected by the men who were both fans of Schiller and advocates of the Swiss Constitution being based on the U.S. Constitution, which it was. Beethoven composed the Mass in C in 1807. It was commissioned by Prince Nicholas II of Esterhazy, who had revived the tradition of his grandfather, Nicholas I, in sponsoring Haydn at the Esterhazy estate. Beethoven knew what shoes he had to fill. He wrote to the prince, "You are accustomed to the inimitable masses of Joseph Haydn." Beethoven studied the masses of Haydn intensely in preparation, but he also knew that he had to create something totally new, not just for artistic reasons, but political reasons. Beethoven had supported Napoleon when he was first consul and seemed so full of promise, even dedicated his Third Symphony to him. However, when in 1804 Napoleon had himself declared emperor, Beethoven ripped up the inscription on his Third Symphony and dedicated it to the memory of a great man, and commented on Napoleon that now he too will become a tyrant and trample on the rights of men. 1804, of course, as we already heard, was the year that Schiller wrote his play Wilhelm Tell. Schiller wrote the play in collaboration with his friend Goethe, who had traveled to Switzerland many times, and it too concerned the Napoleonic threat. Schiller had followed the developments in Switzerland very closely, and the year before Napoleon even launched his coup in 1798, he organized an invasion of Switzerland by France, supposedly to liberate it, but later conscripted over 30,000 Swiss citizens into the French army. The next year, 1805, Napoleon invaded Austria and occupied Vienna. When Beethoven's opera Fidelio premiered in Vienna that year, 1805, the audience was filled with French soldiers. So when Beethoven began work on the Mass in 1807, he was living and writing in an occupied country. So Beethoven had to do something different. He had to give the people hope. To do that, Beethoven reached on the other great revolution of his time, beyond that of Haydn, which was Mozart's rediscovery of Bach and Handel under the leadership of Baron von Swieten. Bach's music had been lost, very few fugues were being written, and Mozart took to it powerfully, including writing a great double fugue in the Kyrie of his Requiem. Beethoven recognized that, and the life of the world to come had to be represented by a fugue, the interplay of many voices, a long and powerful interplay of voices. Thus, Et Vitam Venturi Seculi, Amen, becomes a great and powerful fugue. Unfortunately, I have heard far too many performances of this work that treat it as light, even flippant, go way too fast. And the only performance that I've heard that brings the proper gravitas to it is that of the Schiller Institute Chorus of New York City. So that is the one that I am going to use. Notice that Et Vitam Venturi Seculi, awaiting the life of the world to come, now becomes no longer a mere introduction to Amen, but the substance of the movement. And in my mind, that has to put the emphasis more on the meaning of future generations than your reward in heaven. You can tell from the powerful setting of that short phrase how different Beethoven's view of the Mass was from anything that had been known up to that time, and it did not meet universal approval. The Mass in C was premiered in the Esterházy Palace at Eisenstadt. Prince Nicholas II had a custom, when a new work was being performed, of afterwards pulling together the musicians, dignitaries, and foreign diplomats into his drawing room in order to discuss that work. When Beethoven entered the ongoing discussion, Esterházy proclaimed in a loud voice, "My dear Beethoven, what is it that you have done again?" The chorus director, Hummel, broke out in laughter, and Beethoven left feeling humiliated. Some historians accuse Beethoven of overreacting, but a couple of things suggest otherwise. In such a large palace, you might think they could find a decent room for him, but he was put in a room that had not been prepared for human habitation. The prince wrote in a letter to a countess, "Beethoven's music is unbearably ridiculous and detestable. I am not convinced it can ever be performed properly. I am angry and ashamed." Beethoven left the palace in a huff, never returned there, did not dedicate the Mass to the prince, and never sent him a copy. This just gives you some idea of what Beethoven had to go through to stand up for humanity. In answer, once again, to the now somewhat tired question, can it get any better? Beethoven found himself in a position similar to we today, where it either had to get a whole lot better or a whole lot worse. Napoleon had to be defeated, but that also meant the defeat of France, which was the Republican bulwark in Europe. And what replaced Napoleon was, if anything, worse. The monarchy was restored in France in 1814, and with the Congress of Vienna, 1814 to 1817, the conservative order took up the reins and was determined to crush any written constitutions, any republicanism, anything that resembled the fight for freedom that had gone on, and set out for the total restoration of monarchies and empires. Much like the Treaty of Versailles redrew the map of Europe after World War I, the Congress of Vienna was charged with redrawing the map of Europe after the Napoleonic Wars. Their control over the orchestration of this redrawing of the map was so total that it was referred to as the Concert of Europe. Henry Kissinger once referred to this as a world restored. The concept of the balance of power was developed at that time between the big four powers, the British Empire, the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Prussia, each with their own sphere of influence. Look at the map. How many republics do you see? Europe basically became a police state. The Carlsbad decrees ensured that in Germany, in Austria, works of Schiller and Beethoven were banned. People began to concentrate on home life and the non-political. Artists, poets decided to stay in safer territory like nature. And the emphasis on home life for the middle class meant a blossoming of furniture design and interior decorating as art. Due to the strict control of publication and official censorship, writers primarily concerned themselves with non-political subjects like historical fiction and country life. Political discussion was usually confined to the home in the presence of close friends. The continent was war-weary, and people sacrificed their personal freedoms for peace and stability. The whole period was known as the Biedermeier period, from about 1815 until the 1848 revolutions. Out of fear, a phenomenon known as lapsed classicism was born. People who had admired Beethoven and Schiller could suddenly no longer remember exactly what it was that they saw in them and began to prefer the music of Rossini and his operas. Rossini was undoubtedly a master of bel canto, but his operas are light. and he complained that Beethoven interrupted the natural flow of music. At a certain point, Rossini just stopped composing and became a gourmet cook for the salons of Franz Liszt. Under such conditions, you can choose either to degenerate like everyone else or defy the zeitgeist, defy the spirit of the times, and move forward, even if you're all alone in doing it. Beethoven decided his cast his net into the future, far into the future. No one had a right to expect it of him because no one could have known that such music was even possible. Much of his late music remained incomprehensible to his contemporaries. When they complained they couldn't understand it, he said, "Don't worry, it's not written for you, it's written for the future." And in fact, many of the pieces from this period were not played during his lifetime. He was already the most famous composer in the world. He could have stopped composing or could have improved in a linear fashion, but that's not Beethoven. He developed his creative powers to an absolutely unprecedented degree, and I know of no other composer where the difference between his late works and middle and early works is so great. It's like the advance of one composer over another, Beethoven's advance over himself. Thus, the late works of Beethoven have always held special importance for people who were fighting to move society forward ever since that time. So, if you don't like the way the world is going, don't become an anarchist. Develop your creative powers to the fullest in service of humanity. Think like Beethoven and fight like Beethoven. The Missa Solemnis is one of the most advanced and complex pieces ever written, yet Beethoven inscribed on it, "From the heart to the heart." And if you grasp his central idea, it becomes very comprehensible. The work, however, was not to the taste of the fat and happy Biedermeier Vienna. The police state environment was so intense that Beethoven had the Missa Solemnis premiered in St. Petersburg, Russia in 1824 and did not have it played in Vienna till the next year, 1825. And in Vienna, he could not present it as a mass. He presented it as a series of separate hymns. One was not allowed to play masses outside of the church. In this setting, Beethoven creates a giant, huge, not fugue, but double fugue, with one fugal subject being on Et vitam venturi seculi, and the other on the word Amen. Amen is given equal weight with Et vitam venturi seculi. Why? Properly understood, Amen is the subjunctive mood. It's translated in English as "so be it," in French as "ainsi soit-il." Same thing, the verb tense known as the subjunctive mood. Not "so is it" or "so will it be," but "so be it." A statement of commitment, a desire to bring a certain state of affairs into existence in the future. The composing of this piece was an act of love by Beethoven for the future that reaches us all the way to today. It is meant for you and me. I will accompany it with the appropriate images of that world that Beethoven so fervently wished to bring about.